So this really was a very interesting report that you guys came out with. So in general, let's get to the heart of the matter. Is Beijing expanding its global media influence?
Yes, absolutely. That was really one of the key findings from this research we did, looking quite closely at what's happening in 30 countries across 6 regions around the world. And we absolutely found that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to increase its influence in the media information space in these countries. Specifically in 18 out of the 30, we found very clear evidence of that happening since 2019. But even in some of the others, it had happened, in the year or two before, not during our coverage period. But there's definitely this type of upward trajectory in terms of investment and aggressiveness on the part of Beijing.
So what is this exactly looking like? Like, I love the Global Times. That's my favorite Chinese state-run media. But is it just giving money for, better commercials and promotion for Chinese state-run media, or is it something else?
It's actually a whole suite of different tools and tactics, and some are more open and overt, and others are more covert and sophisticated and coercive. So one big push is expansion of Chinese state media, but especially more recently, it's not so much just having the state media and traditional media reach local audiences directly, because honestly, they didn't have a whole lot of success trying to do that. So instead, they're piggybacking on local media and their audience reach. And so you see these content placements, content sharing agreements, op-eds by and other inserts by Chinese ambassadors into local news outlets in print and broadcast in mainstream media in country after country. And as someone who's been following this kind of Beijing's global media impact for over 10 years, that was really striking. They've done this for a long time in Chinese language media, but in mainstream media across a wide variety of languages, this was pretty new. But really, like country after country, multiple mainstream media outlets running this content that's maybe not Global Times as much as, say, Xinhua or China Daily, China Radio International. And so it's content that's produced by Chinese state news outlets that are directly under the control of the Communist Party's propaganda department or written by the Chinese embassy. And they're just reaching millions and millions and millions of users. It's really massive. We found examples in 130 outlets in these 30 countries. But beyond that, there's also activities being done on social media, disinformation campaigns, networks of fake accounts, ambassadors picking up the phone and trying to squash coverage. It's through this like piggybacking on mainstream media.
I mean, when you talk about piggybacking on mainstream media, is it clear that this content is Chinese state media produced content, or is it kind of like a gray area?
It's pretty gray in a lot of cases. It really varies a lot. In some cases, it's clearly labeled. Often it's labeled as, say, an advertorial or a paid placement, but much less common is that it's clearly labeled as Chinese state-owned media. So even if it's labeled so users know, oh, well, somebody paid for this to come in, or it says in small print also like, oh, this was placed by China Daily, or this is a column that is for the Chinese ambassador. If it's the ambassador, it's a little bit clearer. People know it's the Chinese government, but a lot of it, it's not very clear. And you also have, I guess, other kinds of, I would say, information laundering. So for example, Xinhua will have an agreement with a local newswire, and then they'll run it. And so then, let's say local readers don't know, is this the Ghanaian news agency or Xinhua? Because they're seeing in their local outlet, because the local outlet picked it up from the local news agency. So you also have that. And then you do have examples where it's just like clearly, deliberately not labeled. And there were a few examples in Kenya where that happened. And actually the local media council censured the local public broadcaster because they ran Chinese state media content that was unlabeled. And in the US and Romania, it wasn't the Chinese government in the same way it was Huawei, but they paid local scholars behind the table to write articles saying, oh, we should give Huawei access to our local telecom system. And it only came out later that those people were actually paid to say that. So there's a spectrum.
There's a bunch of different things going on. And I'm remembering like on one hand, there's the China Watch inserts that we used to see in like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. I haven't seen it lately, but I also don't read as much physical newspapers as I used to. But those are labeled and so like fine print, like, you know, paid insert or paid advertisement. And then there's the op-eds, like you talked about, from the Chinese ambassador.
I mean, you see those in the New York Times too.
Yeah, we saw one of those recently. I forget what that was. And then, yeah, like the newswire service. I remember when I used to work for more traditional media, you would get Reuters newswire service. And then if there was like a flood or disaster in China, you would get state-run media footage of that, but it would actually just be the rescue footage. It wouldn't actually show like how much people were suffering.
There's no other kind of footage but rescue footage.
Right, because they make it impossible to get any other kind of footage. So they control the narrative that way.
Yeah, they block outside foreign reporters and only have state-run media.
But then I think Reuters started directly taking CCTV like packages, not just the footage.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
just the full on. So yeah, and then the other one you mentioned, Sarah, was the was it paying third parties to write with a specific perspective.
Yeah.
And that's maybe the hardest to detect.
Yeah. That didn't come up as often, but I think it was also that sometimes you would see even people who work for Chinese state outlets, and this is where China Radio International really stands out. They've got some really talented people who speak the local language, and then they'd get on as like local commentators. Israel and Italy were two places that this really stood out. So they would be on like primetime TV commenting about something related to China. Or in Israel, there was like a news series where this fellow who like speaks fluent Hebrew, but he's Chinese, and he did like these like stories for a local Israeli TV station about manufacturing in China. Toy manufacturing, of course, doesn't say anything about labor issues, you know, political prisoners, you know, things like that. And so they're broadcasting this with Chinese Itzik, you know, who speaks fluent Hebrew. And it doesn't really say clearly that he's actually from China Radio International.
So they hired him as like a stringer to do complete packages.
Yeah, to do complete packages. It's not clear if it's a stringer or if they might have, China Radio International may have even co-produced it. There was another example in Israel where China Radio International actually paid the public broadcaster to co-produce some videos with this fellow. And that only came out after some freedom of information requests and things like that. So I think the money trail is really difficult to track. The U.S. is actually really interesting because we have the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and some of the Chinese state media outlets like China Daily had to register. We actually know a lot more about how much money they're spending and where it's going. And that was also just in the last few years, the Department of Justice started enforcing that more. So it was actually in that context, after there were news reports that had really explicit numbers of how much money was going, say, to the New York Times or the Washington Post, that those outlets discontinued the China Watch supplement. So that's also one reason why, Matt, you probably didn't see it as recently in the newspapers.
And that was a very good change.